Corporate America only cares who holds the keys. When the suits dragged me into human resources on a quiet Tuesday morning, they thought they were tossing a pawn to clear the way for a $500 million buyout. Their smugness was pathetic. They had no idea I had already changed the locks to the very empire they were selling. Want to know how an invisible engineer bankrupts an arrogant board with one piece of paper? Sit down. Hello, and welcome back to Boss Revenge Stories. Before we dive in, I want to humbly share that YouTube has recently disabled monetization on our channel, leaving us without a budget to operate. If you find yourself enjoying today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking personnel to cover their living expenses and continue bringing you more quality stories. You can support our work by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the donation link located in the video description or the pinned comment below. My name is Violet Green. I am 32 years old, an Ohio native, and a hardware engineer specializing in embedded programming. For the past 3 years, I worked at Aegis Core Technologies, an Internet of Things smart home security startup based in Austin, Texas. If you read the flashy press releases, Aegis Core was a shining beacon of modern innovation, poised to revolutionize digital safety. If you worked there, you knew it was nothing more than a toxic, glorified frat house masquerading as a tech company. Aegis Core was a textbook example of everything wrong with the modern startup culture. We had kombucha on tap, an artisan espresso machine in the break room, and a catastrophic lack of actual technical leadership. The executive board operated entirely like an exclusive boys' club. They would secure tens of millions of dollars in venture capital by tossing around meaningless buzzwords to gullible investors, and then proceed to use those funds to buy themselves brand new custom Teslas. Instead of investing in upgrading our aging servers or hiring competent developers, the top brass spent their afternoons playing 18 holes of golf. They were masters of the corporate grift, cashing in on the aesthetics of innovation, while the actual foundation of the company was crumbling underneath them. The crown jewel of Aegis Core was a cybersecurity microchip we called Sentinel. It was the product that the executives were dangling in front of massive telecommunications companies, promising a revolution in encrypted home networks. But the dirty little secret of Aegis Core was that I was the only person in the entire building who truly understood the core architecture of Sentinel. I mapped the logic gates, I wrote the firmware, and I intimately knew every single strength and weakness hidden within the silicon. Despite being the sole architect of their flagship product, I was systematically excluded from every strategic planning meeting. Whenever I requested a seat at the table to discuss the product roadmap, I was met with condescending smirks. During my annual review, the vice president of engineering leaned back in his plush leather chair, chuckled, and said, "You are a great code monkey, Violet, but you just do not have that executive leadership presence we are looking for. We need visionaries in the boardroom, not technicians." What the visionaries failed to realize was that Sentinel had a fatal flaw. There was a critical vulnerability in the handshake protocol that would allow anyone with a cheap packet sniffer to completely bypass the security perimeter. I submitted over a dozen detailed reports outlining the risk, but the management team ignored every single one. They were too busy planning their next luxury retreat to care about a theoretical breach that might ruin our customers. I realized that if the ship went down, they would inevitably blame the engineers. So, I took matters into my own hands. For 4 straight months, I sacrificed my weekends and isolated myself in my sweltering garage. Using my own personal savings, I purchased custom circuit boards and specialized components. I spent hundreds of hours writing, rewriting, and testing a completely new protocol from scratch. I built a breakthrough encryption algorithm that I named V-Shield. It bypassed the hardware limitations of Sentinel entirely and patched the fatal flaw with an elegant, impenetrable layer of security. Thrilled with the results, I brought the V-Shield prototype into the office on a Tuesday morning. I bypassed the standard testing queue, loaded it directly onto our internal network, and watched in pure satisfaction as it flawlessly deflected a simulated brute force attack. I immediately flagged down our chief technology officer to show him the breakthrough. He was a man whose entire personality revolved around wearing expensive tailored suits and suffocating the office with the smell of incredibly cheap, overpowering cologne. He leaned over my desk, barely glancing at the diagnostic metrics flashing in green across my monitor. I spent 10 minutes explaining how V-Shield worked and how it would save the company from a massive liability disaster. When I finally stopped talking, he simply gave a half-hearted nod, checked his luxury watch, and sighed. "Looks neat, Violet," he said in a dismissive tone. "Make sure you push it to the main branch so the marketing team can write some copy for it before Q3. With that, he turned on his heel and walked away to make his lunch reservation. He did not ask how I built it. He did not ask where the architecture came from. He did not offer a single word of recognition for the fact that I had just handed him the absolute salvation of the company on a silver platter. My relentless dedication was not just unappreciated, it was expected as a baseline reality. Sitting there, staring at the blinking cursor on my terminal, a chilling sense of clarity washed over me. I was pouring my blood and intellect into building a magnificent digital castle for a group of arrogant men who did not even know how to properly hold a hammer. That was the exact moment I realized my loyalty was entirely misplaced, and the gears of my revenge silently began to turn. Things went from highly toxic to completely unbearable the moment Human Resources sent out a company-wide email announcing our new Director of Product Management. Enter Chadwick Sterling. He was 29 years old, possessed a professional resume that was essentially a blank piece of paper, and hailed from a family whose generational wealth was older than the state of Texas. His singular defining qualification was the fact that his uncle was the lead angel investor who had just pumped an additional $15 million into our Series B funding round. Chadwick waltzed into our open-plan engineering floor on his very first morning wearing Italian loafers without socks and a custom-tailored linen suit, acting as though he had just single-handedly conquered Silicon Valley. He exuded an aura of unearned arrogance and weaponized incompetence that instantly made my skin crawl. He was precisely the kind of guy who managed to talk for 45 straight minutes during a morning stand-up meeting without actually saying a single substantive word. Chadwick loved to hijack critical engineering discussions by forcefully injecting trendy buzzwords into hardware projects where they had absolutely zero technical relevance. We would be reviewing the basic circuit schematic for a low-energy battery-powered door sensor, and Chadwick would lean against the whiteboard, stroke his chin thoughtfully, and loudly ask the room how we could integrate blockchain technology to ensure decentralized AI processing. Whenever I tried to patiently explain that a simple binary contact sensor did not require a distributed ledger or an artificial intelligence network, he would wave his hand dismissively. He would look at me with pity and tell me I was thinking too small for a unicorn startup. It was purely infuriating. I had to bite my tongue so hard I could taste copper. Forced to sit there and watch this wealthy dilettante play pretend with complex systems he could not even begin to comprehend. The absolute breaking point arrived in mid-October. I caught a severe strain of the flu and was forced to take 4 consecutive days of sick leave. During my physical absence, Chadwick decided to go digitally snooping through the unrestricted internal developer repositories. Because our internal security protocols were as poorly managed as our executive team, he managed to stumble directly into my testing directory. He found absolutely everything. He found the raw source code for V-Shield, the complete architectural diagrams, the simulated performance metrics, and the integration roadmaps I had meticulously documented. He certainly did not possess the technical literacy to write a single line of that complex code, but he was exactly cunning enough to realize its immense financial value to the company. While I was stuck at home running a fever of 102 degrees, Chadwick downloaded my entire life's work onto his local machine. He hastily reformatted the documentation, slapped a heavily branded title page on my slide deck, and brazenly renamed my encryption creation the Sterling Protocol. On the morning of my 3rd sick day, he presented the stolen prototype to the executive board. He pitched it as a revolutionary paradigm shift that he had personally conceptualized late one night to save the flagship product from ruin. According to my furious colleagues who texted me the horrifying updates in real time, the board members literally gave him a standing ovation. I returned to the office on Monday morning, operating on pure, unadulterated adrenaline and blinding rage. I bypassed the receptionist, marched straight into Chadwick's sprawling corner office, and slammed the heavy glass door shut behind me. I aggressively demanded to know what the hell he thought he was doing stealing my encryption architecture. I fully expected him to panic, or perhaps stammer out a pathetic excuse. Instead, he simply leaned back in his ergonomic leather chair, folded his hands behind his head, and flashed a perfectly bright, incredibly condescending smile. He slowly stood up, walked around his massive oak desk, and had the absolute audacity to pat me gently on the shoulder. "Violet, Violet," he cooed, using the soothing, patronizing tone one might reserve for a confused and emotional toddler. "You really need to look at the bigger picture here. At the ground employee level, it is very easy to get overly attached to your little lines of code. But at the executive management level, we do not have personal projects. We share the collective vision of the company. When you build something on company time, it belongs to the corporate family. Calling it theft is just so horribly selfish of you. We are a team, right? You need to learn how to be a team player." I aggressively swatted his hand away, glaring daggers into his smug, unblemished face. I told him he knew exactly what he did and that he was a fraud. But before I could utter another threat, he sighed heavily, picked up his desk phone, and dialed Human Resources. Within 2 hours, my digital life at the company was completely severed. My administrative privileges were permanently revoked across the entire network. I was locked out of every high-level project folder, including the very directory that housed my original work, under the official guise of a structural department realignment. I was officially demoted to maintaining our decaying legacy systems. It was a humiliating, dead-end assignment meant to keep me quiet, out of sight, and buried in useless bug tickets. They deliberately isolated me from my own brainchild, building an impenetrable corporate firewall between me and the Sterling Protocol. Chadwick truly thought he had successfully neutralized a minor internal threat. He thought I was just a disgruntled worker bee who would quietly accept defeat and fade into the background. He was profoundly, catastrophically mistaken. Most individuals in my position would have marched straight down to the Human Resources Department to demand immediate justice. That is a rookie mistake, born from the naive belief that corporate structures exist to enforce fairness. Human Resources does not exist to protect the employees. It exists exclusively to shield the executive board from legal liability. Filing a formal grievance would have been professional suicide. It would have placed a massive neon target on my back and provided Chadwick with the advanced warning he needed to systematically destroy whatever digital evidence he had clumsily left behind. So, I swallowed my pride and engaged in a strategy of absolute, deafening silence. I did not scream, I did not shed a single tear, and I firmly resisted the urge to send a passive-aggressive email to the entire engineering department. Instead, I put on a masterclass in quiet submission. When they handed me my demotion paperwork, I simply nodded, signed on the dotted line, and dragged my belongings to my new, depressing cubicle, located on the basement level. I began diligently closing legacy server tickets, playing the part of the defeated, broken, and thoroughly domesticated engineer perfectly. Chadwick and his executive cronies stopped looking my way entirely, safely assuming the threat had been completely neutralized. They fundamentally forgot the most dangerous thing you can possibly do is leave a highly skilled, fiercely motivated engineer alone in the dark with a command line terminal and plenty of undisturbed time to think. While I pretended to be completely absorbed in patching ancient operating systems and fixing minor user interface bugs, I was covertly orchestrating a meticulous, highly sophisticated data extraction operation. Chadwick might have been a smooth talker who knew how to command a boardroom, but his operational security was laughably amateur. He had brazenly copied my files, but he possessed neither the technical literacy nor the foresight to sanitize the deep network access logs. operating under the radar through a secure background script I had written months prior. I quietly pulled the server history from the exact 4-day window I was out sick with the flu. I successfully captured the indisputable timestamps showing his specific machine pinging my restricted directories, forcefully bypassing a weak internal firewall, downloading the raw repositories, and subsequently modifying the document metadata to feature his own name. But digital logs, no matter how damning, can always be disputed by a team of highly paid corporate defense attorneys. I needed physical, tangible, undeniable proof of my prior ownership. Thankfully, long before I ever brought the V-Shield prototype into the Aegis Corps building, I had relied on an old-school engineering trick known as a poor man's copyright. For over 14 months, whenever I reached a major coding milestone in my sweltering garage, I meticulously printed out the raw source code, the intricate circuit schematics, and my handwritten architectural notes. I sealed them in heavy-duty tamper-evident envelopes and mailed them to my own home address through the United States Postal Service. I had a massive stack of unopened, federally postmarked packages sitting in my personal fireproof safe, unequivocally proving I had authored the core encryption protocol a full 12 months before Chadwick even learned how to spell the word blockchain. During my deep, unauthorized dive into the network architecture, my tracking script accidentally hooked into a hidden administrative directory that our chief financial officer had carelessly left exposed on a shared internal drive. I started sifting through the encrypted email drafts and the external financial audit requests, and suddenly, the entire puzzle clicked into place with terrifying clarity. Aegis Corps was not just trying to raise another round of venture capital to keep the lights on. They were secretly in the final stages of negotiating a massive, monumental acquisition deal. A global telecommunications conglomerate was preparing to buy our startup outright. The negotiated purchase price was a staggering $500 million. But the most revealing and sickening detail was buried deep within the legal term sheets. The conglomerate had absolutely zero interest in our failing legacy hardware or our flashy, golf-playing executive team. The entire valuation, the sole reason the buyout price was pushed to $500 million, was strictly contingent on the exclusive acquisition of the so-called Sterling Protocol. Chadwick had essentially handed the executives the ultimate golden goose, and they were rushing to sell the entire farm before the buyers looked too closely at the feathers. I knew exactly what my next move had to be, but executing it required the heaviest, most ruthless legal artillery that money could buy. I mercilessly liquidated my entire personal savings account, cashed out my meager stock portfolio, and maxed out 3 separate high-yield credit cards to gather the necessary capital. I submitted a formal request to my manager for 5 days of paid medical leave, citing severe workplace anxiety and the desperate need for an urgent psychiatric evaluation. The human resources director approved it immediately, likely thrilled at the prospect of building a paper trail that painted me as mentally unstable and unfit for duty. But I did not go to a therapist, and I certainly did not rest. I booked a red-eye flight straight to New York City and confidently walked into the towering glass and steel skyscraper of the most notorious, shark-like intellectual property law firm on the East Coast. I sat across a massive mahogany conference table from 3 senior partners and carefully laid out my postmarked envelopes, the encrypted network logs, and a certified copy of my standard Aegis Corps employment contract. For 6 hours, they scrutinized every single line of code and every single legal clause. The final verdict they delivered was absolute music to my ears, because I had developed the entire core architecture on my own personal hardware, entirely outside of regular company working hours, and specifically because my hastily drafted employment contract lacked a comprehensive blanket assignment clause for uncommissioned, non-competing side projects. Aegis Corps had absolutely zero legal claim to the intellectual property. I owned it, 100%. Working frantically alongside the lawyers over the next 48 hours, I immediately established a private shell company, registering it as an anonymous limited liability corporation based out of Delaware. Through that fortified legal entity, we aggressively filed 3 ironclad, exclusive patents for the encryption architecture. I legally locked down the predictive algorithms, the hardware integration methods, and the specific digital handshake protocols. The legal snare was now perfectly woven, completely invisible to the naked eye, and absolutely inescapable. I flew back to Austin and returned to the office the following Monday morning, feeling an intoxicating, almost dangerous sense of calm washing over me. I went straight back to my basement desk, sipping my cheap, lukewarm break room coffee, and resumed closing low-priority bug tickets as if nothing had changed. Every morning, I would casually walk past the glass-walled conference rooms and watch Chadwick strutting around in his expensive tailored suits. I watched him aggressively pointing at the whiteboards, confidently pitching my life's work to visiting investment bankers and the telecommunications acquisition team. I listened to him loudly brag by the water cooler about the upcoming press launch event, eagerly soaking in the blind admiration of the executive board members who were already picking out the custom colors for their next sports cars. He looked so incredibly proud, so deeply and genuinely convinced of his own manufactured genius. He had absolutely no idea that he was happily tap dancing on a rigged trap door, and my hand was resting quietly, patiently, right on the release lever. Exactly 14 days before the massive telecommunications buyout was scheduled to be officially finalized, the executive board initiated their final phase of corporate house cleaning. When a startup is about to be swallowed whole by a conglomerate, the leadership desperately wants the employee roster to look as pristine and compliant as possible. Anyone deemed a flight risk, a potential whistleblower, or simply a disgruntled employee is swiftly excised from the payroll. Naturally, my name was sitting right at the top of their elimination list. But there was a far more sinister, financially motivated reason for my sudden termination. I was holding 50,000 shares of unvested company stock that were set to fully mature in exactly 2 months. If I remained employed through the acquisition, those shares would automatically trigger a payout worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. By firing me for cause before the ink dried on the merger, the executives could legally dissolve my equity, tossing my shares back into the executive bonus pool. Capitalist hypocrisy operates with brutal, mathematical precision. I received a vague calendar invite for a mandatory sync just after lunch. When I arrived at the designated executive conference room on the top floor, I found myself walking into a perfectly transparent glass box. It was designed to make you feel exposed to the entire office. Sitting across the polished marble table was Chadwick Sterling, wearing a brand new, obscenely expensive navy blue suit, alongside Brenda, our Director of Human Resources. Brenda was a woman who possessed a terrifying ability to weaponize corporate empathy. She wore a soft, pastel cardigan and practiced the kind of aggressive, active listening that made you feel like you were being interrogated by a smiling sociopath. I sat down in the rigid, uncomfortable chair. Brenda leaned forward, clasping her perfectly manicured hands together, and deployed a deeply theatrical sigh of profound disappointment. "Violet, we are so incredibly saddened to have this conversation with you today," she began, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "But our network administration team has flagged some highly concerning and irregular activity originating from your workstation." She slid a thin, generic-looking folder across the table. "I did not even bother to open it," Brenda continued. Adopting a tone of stern parental reprimand, she informed me that they had supposedly detected a suspicious pattern of me downloading massive amounts of legacy system data. She accused me of committing a severe breach of corporate trust, heavily implying that I was actively planning to sell proprietary company secrets to our direct competitors. It was an entirely fabricated narrative. The data they were referencing was the exact same obsolete legacy maintenance data they had explicitly reassigned me to manage when they demoted me. They possessed absolutely zero legitimate evidence of any wrongdoing because there was no wrongdoing to be found. But the truth did not matter inside that glass room. They did not need a conviction. They only needed a plausible-sounding pretext to check the box for a termination with cause. They wanted me gone. They wanted my stock options terminated. And they wanted to ensure I left feeling completely powerless and legally terrified. Chadwick sat there the entire time, practically vibrating with smug satisfaction. He thought he was witnessing my ultimate defeat. He expected me to shatter. He anticipated a desperate, emotional outburst. He wanted me to scream about the injustice, to cry about my stolen project, or to frantically beg Brenda for a second chance so he could relish his absolute authority over my career. I gave them absolutely nothing. I did not offer a single word of defense. I did not shed a single tear. The silence in the room stretched out, becoming heavy and suffocating for them, while I remained perfectly, comfortably still. I let Brenda finish her rehearsed corporate monologue about severance being denied. Then, I slowly shifted my gaze away from human resources and locked eyes directly with Chadwick. I stared through him with a chilling, deadpan intensity. "I have exactly one question for you," I said, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "Are you absolutely, unequivocally sure that this system can run without my keys?" Chadwick scoffed, a short, arrogant burst of laughter escaping his lips. He leaned forward, grabbed a heavy brass pen, and arrogantly signed his name across the bottom of my termination paperwork. "We are going to manage just fine without your maintenance help, Violet," he sneered, tossing the document toward Brenda. "We have actual visionaries steering the ship now. It is time for you to go." Brenda pressed a button on the conference phone, and within 60 seconds, 2 burly private security contractors entered the glass room. They were instructed to escort me directly out of the building. I was not allowed to return to my desk. I was not permitted to collect my personal coffee mug or say goodbye to my colleagues. I was frog-marched through the main lobby like a dangerous criminal, paraded in front of the entire engineering floor to serve as a visual warning to anyone else who might dare to step out of line. As the heavy glass doors of Aegis Core Technologies locked firmly behind me, leaving me standing on the blistering hot Austin sidewalk, Chadwick genuinely believed he had just eliminated the final obstacle to his $500 million payday. He was completely blissfully unaware that by forcing me out of the building, he had just permanently locked himself inside a burning house. Exactly 3 days after my unceremonious exit, the final piece of the puzzle arrived quietly in my residential mailbox. It was a thick, pristine envelope from the United States Patent and Trademark Office, forwarded directly by my legal team in New York. Sitting at my kitchen counter with a steaming mug of black tea, I carefully sliced the seal open. There, printed on heavy legal paper with official federal seals, were the formal notices of allowance for all 3 of my patent applications. In the eyes of the federal government, every single core algorithm, every hardware integration method, and every proprietary encryption handshake operating inside Aegis Core's flagship system was now the exclusive, unassailable legal property of my anonymous Delaware Limited Liability Corporation. I traced my finger over the raised ink, feeling the immense weight of the moment. I had not just taken back my work, I had legally weaponized it. While I was enjoying the peaceful solitude of my apartment, the corporate gears downtown were grinding toward a catastrophic halt. The telecommunications giant looking to acquire Aegis Core had officially entered the most rigorous phase of the buyout process, known as due diligence. When a conglomerate prepares to spend $500 million, they do not just take your word for it. They unleash an army of forensic accountants and intellectual property attorneys to aggressively audit every single asset on the balance sheet. Naturally, the very first thing the acquiring lawyers demanded was the certified chain of title and full patent documentation for the highly touted Sterling Protocol. The executive board turned to Chadwick, expecting him to casually produce the paperwork for his supposed genius invention. But of course, he had absolutely nothing to give them. He stalled, claiming the filings were still being processed by external counsel, but time was up. At precisely 9 o'clock on a Thursday morning, the exact moment the due diligence meetings commenced in the Aegis Core executive boardroom, my legal team initiated a coordinated, devastating strike. They did not just send a warning, they unleashed a synchronized legal bombardment. Volleys of aggressive cease and desist orders were delivered simultaneously via certified overnight mail and high-priority emails to the entire Aegis Core board of directors, their chief legal officer, and most crucially, directly to the General Counsel of the telecommunications conglomerate. The documents were not vague threats. They were highly technical, surgically precise legal instruments. The letters explicitly detailed how the so-called Sterling Protocol was entirely composed of stolen intellectual property. My lawyers cited specific directory names, exact lines of source code, and hardware schematics that Aegis Corps was actively demonstrating to their buyers. The mandate was absolute. We demanded the immediate cessation of all commercialization, marketing, and transferring of the encryption technology, threatening federal injunctions if they moved a single inch forward. The reaction was instantaneous and apocalyptic. The telecommunications conglomerate, absolutely horrified at the prospect of buying a stolen, legally radioactive product, immediately froze the entire $500 million transaction. The lead acquiring attorney reportedly stood up, packed his briefcase in dead silence, and delivered a brutal ultimatum before walking out of the glass room. Aegis Corps was given exactly 24 hours to produce undeniable proof of ownership, or the conglomerate would not only walk away from the deal, but would also file a massive counter-lawsuit for criminal fraud and intentional misrepresentation. Inside Aegis Corps, the atmosphere devolved into pure, unadulterated panic. The executive board members, realizing their luxury cars and golden parachutes were rapidly vanishing into thin air, cornered Chadwick, his arrogant veneer completely shattered. He was sweating profusely, stammering out pathetic denials, desperately trying to convince a room full of furious millionaires that he was the true author and that this was just a baseless extortion attempt by a patent troll. Desperate to validate his claims, the chief executive officer ordered the remaining senior engineering team to immediately audit the core repositories and tear the code apart line by line to prove it was developed internally. That was when they stumbled right into the final, inescapable snare I had left behind in the dark. During the frantic code review, the lead developer ran a deep structural diagnostic on the root compiler. He noticed a bizarre anomaly buried deep within the initialization sequence. Long before Chadwick had ever snooped through my files, I had embedded a highly obfuscated digital backdoor, an engineering Easter egg woven directly into the foundational logic gates of the architecture. It was designed to remain entirely dormant unless a specific, obscure command prompt was executed during a system boot. Under the intense scrutiny of the panicked executives, the lead engineer unintentionally triggered the sequence. Suddenly, the diagnostic screens across the entire engineering floor cleared, the standard boot sequence halted, and a solitary string of text began to print across dozens of monitors in bright, undeniable white font. It read, "Architecture and Protocol exclusively authored by Violet Green, licensed solely to," followed by the exact registration number and name of my Delaware Limited Liability Company. Every single command prompt, every encrypted handshake, and every data packet processed by their supposedly revolutionary system ultimately pointed directly back to my unshakable legal copyright. The digital watermark was permanently baked into the silicon, rendering the entire source code utterly useless to anyone who did not possess the cryptographic keys. Standing in the middle of the server room, surrounded by flashing monitors broadcasting my name, Chadwick stared blankly at the screens. The realization finally crashed down upon him. He had not stolen a product. He had stolen a ticking time bomb, and the timer had just reached 0. The emergency board meeting that followed was, by all accounts from my former colleagues, a bloodbath of epic proportions. The executives dragged a completely pale, visibly shaking Chadwick Sterling into the main glass conference room. They threw the printed source code and the newly discovered backdoor encryption logs directly onto the polished marble table. The chief executive officer, his face purple with absolute rage, handed Chadwick a dry erase marker and pointed at the massive whiteboard. He demanded that their supposed visionary genius explain just one single cryptographic equation from the project he had so proudly claimed as his own. Chadwick stood there completely frozen. He stammered incoherently, his hands trembling so violently that he dropped the marker twice. He could not even articulate the basic mathematical principles of the algorithms, let alone defend the complex architecture. The entire facade was obliterated in an instant. The Golden Boy was finally exposed as nothing more than a wealthy, thieving fraud. Realizing that their $500 million golden parachute was currently strapped to a sinking anvil, the chief executive officer was forced to swallow every last ounce of his towering pride. My cell phone rang later that afternoon. I let it ring 4 times before I finally answered. The voice on the other end was frantic, entirely stripped of the arrogant corporate polish he normally wielded. He begged me to come back to the office immediately to negotiate. He frantically promised to reinstate my employment with a full retroactive promotion to Senior Vice President of Engineering, offering a guaranteed contract at 3 times my previous annual salary. "Violet, please," he pleaded into the receiver. "We are a family here. Let us just sweep this entire misunderstanding under the rug and move forward together." I did not raise my voice, nor did I entertain his desperate bargaining. I simply told him, "I am not interested in meeting face to face. From this moment forward, you will only speak to my legal representatives." I hung up the phone. Within 5 minutes, my legal team in New York transmitted a single, non-negotiable ultimatum directly to the Aegis Corps Board of Directors. The terms were brutally straightforward. I was not selling them the intellectual property. I would retain absolute ownership forever. However, I was willing to grant them a perpetual, not exclusive commercial license to utilize the technology, allowing their acquisition deal with the telecommunications conglomerate to proceed. The price for this license was $50 million in cash, to be paid as a single, upfront lump sum via wire transfer by the end of the business day. But the money was merely the financial penalty. The true cost of their salvation was buried in the mandatory behavioral clauses of my contract. I stipulated that before any license would be granted, Chadwick Sterling had to be terminated immediately, with extreme prejudice and for explicit legal cause, entirely stripping him of his unvested shares and any executive severance package. Furthermore, Aegis Corps was legally required to draft and distribute a public company-wide memorandum explicitly acknowledging my sole authorship of the technology and issuing a formal apology for their egregious administrative errors. The executive board was completely backed into a corner. On one side, they faced total corporate bankruptcy, a collapsed acquisition, and highly probable federal indictments for defrauding their investors. On the other side, they had my contract. Driven by pure self-preservation, they did not even attempt to counteroffer. They gritted their teeth, signed the licensing agreement, and authorized the massive wire transfer. That very same afternoon, Chadwick Sterling experienced the exact same brutal reality check he had so gleefully subjected me to. 2 heavy-set private security guards marched into his sprawling corner office, handed him a single, beat-up cardboard box, and ordered him to pack up his desk. He was not allowed to log off his computer or say goodbye to his executive friends. He was frog-marched straight through the center of the open-plan engineering floor. This time, there was no silence. Every single engineer, developer, and technician he had ever patronized stood up from their desks and openly laughed at him. He walked out of the glass doors a completely broken, humiliated man, his reputation in the tech industry permanently reduced to ashes. As for me, the story ends exactly where it should. I am currently sitting on the sweeping outdoor balcony of my brand-new, ultra-luxury penthouse apartment. The Austin skyline is glittering beautifully against the night sky. I am holding a glass of incredibly expensive vintage red wine in my hand. My cell phone is resting on the table beside me, the screen glowing softly to display my primary banking application. I take a slow, deeply satisfying sip of my wine as I watch my available account balance officially increase by 8 massive figures. A genuine, unshakable smile spreads across my face. I look out over the city, thinking back to that miserable little glass room, and I cannot help but laugh out loud at the memory of human resources telling me I lacked strategic vision. Thank you so very much for taking the time to listen to my story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please let me know your city or country in the comments below. If you found today's revenge story satisfying and entertaining, please consider helping us out. You can support the channel with just a $1 donation by scanning the QR code currently on your screen, or by using the donation link provided in the video description and pinned comment. Your incredible generosity allows us to pay our dedicated staff, helping them support their families so we can continue creating and sharing these amazing stories with you. Thank you again, and have a wonderful day.